Everyone in the Eastern Empire knew her name. Navier Eli Trovi, the empress who never faltered. She was the embodiment of nobility, refined, intelligent, composed beyond measure. At royal banquets, she dazzled foreign diplomats with her eloquence. In council meetings, even seasoned ministers fell silent when she spoke. Her beauty was undeniable, tall, graceful, with eyes like polished amber and a voice as calm as still water. But it wasn't her appearance that made her legendary. It was her restraint, her discipline, her perfection. To the people, she was a blessing from the gods. To the nobles, she was the empire's greatest asset. And to Emperor Sovishu, at least once, she had been everything. They were wed young, the children of power, bound not just by politics, but by shared memories. As prince and princess, they'd grown together, from tentative smiles to late-night talks under the palace stars. Sovieshu had once held her hand like it was something precious. He used to watch her with quiet pride when she took the empress's seat beside him. He used to say her name like a promise. And she believed him. Navier loved her empire, but she adored her husband. And in return, she gave him everything: her loyalty, her strength, her silence. She never questioned his decisions in public. She never showed exhaustion. Even when palace whispers turned cruel, even when the endless pressure left her breathless, she never let it show. That was her role. That was her vow. But recently, the air had changed. It started subtly. A missed dinner. A delayed letter. A moment too long between glances. Sovishu began traveling more, staying later in meetings, answering her questions with half-hearted nods. And when she asked him directly, his replies were kind, but empty, like someone repeating the words they knew she wanted to hear. Still, she said nothing. She smiled. She wore her crown. She reminded herself that love sometimes cooled in marriage, that perhaps he was simply tired, burdened, distracted. She refused to believe that the man she had stood beside for so long would ever betray her. But beneath the surface of her poised exterior, a storm was brewing. It whispered in the back of her mind at night. It flickered behind her eyes when she looked in the mirror. There was something unspoken between them now. A space. A silence. And worse, a presence. The servants had grown cautious in her presence, lowering their voices when she entered. Ladies-in-waiting exchanged glances when the emperor's name was mentioned. Rumors stirred like wind under a closed door. Vague, faceless stories about a woman. A foreigner, someone who had caught the emperor's attention. Navier didn't ask. She didn't need to. Her instincts, honed by years of court intrigue, told her all she needed to know. But still, she wore her crown. Still, she stood beside him at public events with her head held high. Still, she smiled for the people. Because she was not just a woman, she was the empress. And even as her world began to shift beneath her feet, Navier vowed that no one, not Sovishu, not this mysterious woman, not even the empire itself, would see her break. But behind the palace walls, fate was already moving, and the first crack in her perfect life had formed. Not loud, not visible, but deep, and it would only grow. It began with whispers, not loud enough to be called gossip, not daring enough to be spoken aloud. Just quiet fragments of conversation that vanished the moment Navier entered a room. At first, she dismissed them. In a palace filled with nobles, schemers, and servants, rumors were as common as gold leaf on a letter. But soon, the fragments began to form a pattern. A name never spoken, a face never described, just hints, always the same. He visits the West Wing more often these days. She was seen again near the Rose Garden, the one only the emperor uses. They say she's foreign, beautiful. Navier never reacted. Not when her ladies-in-waiting grew tense around her. Not when the ministers stumbled over words they usually delivered with ease. Not even when she overheard her name paired with the word replaceable. She simply smiled. But inside, her heart was no longer calm. Sovishu, once predictable in his routines, now shifted like sand. He'd skip meals with her to attend urgent state matters. He delayed their walks in the palace gardens, a ritual they'd kept for years. When they did speak, it was business. Formal, brief, like an empress and her emperor, not a husband and wife. And yet, the signs were everywhere. One afternoon, Navier arrived at the imperial tea room to find it already occupied. The servants froze, startled to see her, as if they hadn't expected her to come. The room reeked faintly of a sweet perfume she'd never worn, a scent too bold to be hers. No one said a word. The tray of untouched tea still sat between two empty chairs. She walked away without asking questions, but she didn't need to. The palace, once her sanctuary, had begun to feel foreign. Walls that had witnessed her strength now echoed with doubt. Doors once open to her now closed without explanation. Her people still bowed, but their eyes flickered. With sympathy? Pity? She couldn't tell. Perhaps she didn't want to. One evening, as she stood before the mirror in her private chambers, brushing her hair with practiced elegance, she paused. For the first time, she didn't recognize the woman in the glass. The same flawless face stared back. The same regal posture. The same composed expression. But behind the perfection was something new. Something hollow. A question that refused to be silenced. What did I do wrong? She had given everything. Her youth, her loyalty, her love. She had bent, never broken, for the sake of her crown and her husband. And now it felt like none of it mattered. Not to him. Outside, the palace sparkled as always. The Eastern Empire still praised its perfect empress. But perfection, she realized, was fragile. And when it cracked, it didn't make a sound. Not yet. But it would. The day she arrived, the entire palace changed. Not with a storm, but with silence. The kind that settles over a crowd before lightning strikes. Navier stood at the grand staircase, her hands folded delicately before her, as servants rushed past in quiet panic. Footsteps echoed down the marble halls. A foreign delegation had arrived, she was told. An unannounced visit, but the guards bowed too low. The nobles avoided her gaze. And the emperor? The emperor didn't come to her first. He went to her. Navier watched from a distance as Sovishu, her husband, the ruler of the Eastern Empire, descended the steps with an eager gleam in his eye. He extended his hand to a woman cloaked in crimson silk. Tall, striking, unfamiliar, with golden hair like flames and a smirk that wasn't quite respectful. The court fell into stunned silence. He introduced her as Lady Rashta. A noblewoman, he said, from a distant land. A guest, he insisted. But Navier saw the truth in his eyes. Not duty, desire. And in that moment, something inside her went still. Lady Rashta was given a room in the East Wing, the one reserved for visiting royalty. She dined at the emperor's table. She appeared in the royal gardens. Her laughter echoed through the halls that had once belonged to Navier's quiet grace. And Sovishu? He followed her like a moth to flame. The rumors were no longer whispers. They were roars. The court buzzed with scandal. Ministers stumbled through speeches. Servants avoided eye contact. And yet, every day, Navier did what she always had. She woke before dawn. She attended her duties. She greeted foreign ambassadors with grace. She wore gowns of silk and diamonds, her armor, and sat beside the man who no longer looked at her. But it was no longer her throne they talked about. It was her replacement. In the ballroom, Rashta glided in late, draped in fabrics far too luxurious for a guest. When introduced, she curtsied too low, her eyes darting briefly to Navier. Not with fear, but challenge. The insult was clear. And Sovishu? He said nothing. He stood beside Rashta, offering her his arm, smiling down at her like she was the sun, as if Navier, the empress, his wife, were invisible. That night, alone in her chambers, Navier sat without moving. Her fingers rested on her lap, her posture perfect, but her heart a battlefield. She had not cried. She would not cry, because even as the world mocked her, even as her husband paraded another woman through her palace, Navier knew who she was. She was the empress. She had ruled with dignity. And even now, surrounded by betrayal, she would not break. But somewhere deep within her, beneath the still surface, something began to stir. Not grief, not rage, resolve. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Winter crept into the palace long before the snow fell. Cold silence had settled between Navier and Sovishu, thick and heavy, like frost on glass. They still shared the same halls, the same table, the same throne, but not the same world. Not anymore. Navier performed her duties with practiced perfection. Her posture was flawless, her expression unreadable. She still smiled before the court, still hosted foreign dignitaries, still wore the crown as if it were made for her, because it was. But behind the grandeur, her heart was already mourning something she hadn't yet buried. And then it happened. Not in private, not behind closed doors, but in the throne room, beneath the painted ceiling and gilded pillars, where the court had gathered for the day's proceedings. Navier sat beside Sovishu, adorned in sapphire silk and gold filigree, listening as ministers recited trade reports. It was routine, boring even. But then Sovishu raised a hand, silencing the room. "I have an announcement," he said. Navier turned to him. The corner of her mouth politely curved. She expected a policy change, perhaps an alliance. What she got was a blade to the heart. "I am seeking a divorce." The room froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the wind outside seemed to halt in shock. Navier's smile didn't falter. Not at first. She blinked, slowly, as if waiting to wake up. Perhaps she'd misheard. Perhaps he'd misspoken. But Sovishu continued. "I intend to dissolve our marriage," he said calmly, almost clinically. "I will take Lady Rashta as my new wife." Gasps echoed around them. Nobles looked at one another in disbelief. Servants dropped trays. A minister stumbled backward. And Navier sat still. Not a flicker of emotion crossed her face. No tears, no rage, only silence. For one eternal second, time stood still. Then she rose. Every eye followed her as she stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was like ice, clear, sharp, and commanding. "I accept this divorce." A gasp escaped someone's lips. "And ask approval for my second marriage." Shock rippled through the room like a tidal wave. Sovishu's face drained of color. "What?" Navier turned to him, and for the first time in months, she looked at him directly. Not as his wife, not as his empress, but as a woman who had already moved beyond him. "I have been corresponding with Emperor Heinrich of the Western Empire," she said. "He has offered his hand in marriage. I accept." The court erupted. Voices clashed. The ministers stammered. Sovishu stood, furious, confused, betrayed. The very emotions he had never considered she could feel too. But Navier? She simply walked away. Head high, crown shining. She had arrived in that throne room a discarded wife. She left it a future queen. The world watched in stunned silence. The Eastern Empire's perfect empress had accepted a divorce, and in the same breath, announced her second marriage. Not weeks later, not days, seconds. Some called it scandal. Others called it genius. But Navier didn't care what they called it. For the first time in her life, she was choosing. Behind the palace walls, Sovishu raged. He accused her of betrayal, of deceit, of dishonoring the crown. But how could she betray a man who had already discarded her for another? His fury rang hollow now. Too little, too late. And Navier, no longer the obedient wife, didn't offer him comfort. She offered him silence. But far away, in the Western Empire, someone else had been listening. Heinrich, the mysterious emperor she had once exchanged harmless letters with. Diplomatic, polite, even witty. She remembered his neat handwriting, the playful remarks he slipped between formal lines. A man shrouded in mystery, and yet strangely familiar. Their correspondence had started innocently. Quiet exchanges between two rulers, formal greetings, political matters, harmless jokes tucked into the margins. But over time, their words grew warmer, deeper. She had laughed at his letters. Real laughter, the kind she hadn't felt in months. And though she never dared admit it aloud, she had looked forward to each reply. When news of her public divorce reached the West, Heinrich didn't hesitate. He crossed oceans of etiquette. He shattered royal traditions. And he made her an offer no one saw coming. A marriage, not just of politics, though it would certainly shift the balance of power between East and West. No, Heinrich's proposal came with something more than duty, respect, safety, and the chance The smallest, most dangerous chance at healing. Navier stood at her window, holding his letter in trembling hands. The wax seal bore the Western crest. The handwriting was his, elegant, bold, unmistakably him. If you would stand beside me, Navier, not as a discarded empress, but as my equal, I would be honored to take your hand. The room was silent, except for the whisper of the wind. She had been raised to consider every decision from the throne's perspective, to weigh the consequences, the alliances, the enemies it might awaken. But for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if this wasn't just about empires? What if it was about her? Saying yes meant abandoning everything she had built in the East, the palace that was once her home, the people who once adored her. It meant walking into an unknown court, beside a man she barely knew. But it also meant freedom. It meant a life where she didn't have to hide her strength behind silence, where her laughter wasn't a memory. Navier took a deep breath and sent her reply, yes. The Eastern Empire watched as Navier Elie Trovy, once its flawless empress, departed with her head held high and her crown shining in the morning light. There were no tears, no final goodbyes, only silence, as if the palace itself held its breath. She didn't look back, and she didn't need to. A grand procession awaited her at the border, where the banners of the Western Empire fluttered in the wind. Soldiers bowed low, nobles greeted her with awe, and at the very front, dressed in silver and navy, stood the man who had rewritten her fate with a single letter, Emperor Heinrich. He smiled when he saw her, not with pomp or pride, but with quiet warmth. The kind of smile that said, "You're safe now. You're welcome here." Their wedding was swift but magnificent. The Western Empire, intrigued by their mysterious emperor's bold proposal, flocked to witness the union. Some expected a cold political arrangement. Others whispered that she was using him, or he her. But when Heinrich offered his hand, and Navier placed hers in his without hesitation, the rumors fell silent. The ceremony ended, and a new title echoed through the great hall, Empress Navier of the Western Empire. But titles alone could not undo the past. The days that followed were filled with unfamiliarity, new customs, new languages, a new palace, brighter, more open, yet still strange. Courtiers studied her with suspicion, unsure if she was the loyal partner they hoped for, or the political weapon they feared. Navier, as always, kept her composure. She learned quickly. She memorized names, traditions, expectations. She ruled beside Heinrich with the same quiet strength she had once shown in the East. But something was different, because Heinrich, unlike Sovietshu, saw her. He noticed when she was tired. He offered his arm, but never demanded her hand. He never paraded her around like a prize. And when he laughed, it was not to impress. It was genuine, often ridiculous, and so disarming she didn't know whether to scold or smile. And slowly, she began to smile again. One evening, they stood on the palace balcony overlooking the gardens. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the empire that was now hers. "You don't have to be perfect here," Heinrich said softly. Navier turned to him, surprised. "I don't understand." He smiled, not at her crown, but at her. "You don't have to carry everything alone." The words sank into her like sunlight through frost. She didn't reply, not right away. But for the first time in years, she let herself lean, just slightly, towards someone else. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning. And Navier, reborn in a foreign empire, realized something powerful. She had been forced to leave her past behind. But perhaps, just perhaps, she was finally becoming herself. The Western Empire was a land of sunlight, laughter, and unexpected warmth. But beneath the gilded halls and blooming courtyards, the court was a battlefield, and Navier was once again at the center of it. To some, she was a dignified ruler, a woman of grace and intelligence, capable of bringing stability to a foreign empire. To others, she was a threat, a discarded wife turned queen, whose presence disrupted alliances, whispered secrets, and stirred old fears. And to a select few, the ones who had long eyed the emperor's favor, she was an obstacle to be removed. Whispers began to rise. She only married him to spite Sovishu. She'll never be loyal to the West. She's cold, calculating, dangerous. Navier heard them all. Every cruel assumption, every veiled insult disguised as politeness. But she didn't flinch. She had worn a heavier crown before. She had survived worse. What they didn't understand was that Navier no longer ruled for approval. She ruled because she had earned it. Still, the court was not the only place where unrest brewed. Far away, in the Eastern Empire, Sovishu was unraveling. He had gotten what he wanted, a divorce, a new wife, a second chance. But the throne beside him was colder now. Rashta, once charming and sweet, had grown possessive and unpredictable. Her joy in victory turned sour under the weight of responsibility. The nobles who once feared Navier's perfection now whispered openly about the emperor's foolishness. The court that had once bowed to Sovishu with reverence now eyed him with quiet disdain. And in his silence, in the lonely echo of his halls, he began to ask a question he never thought he would. Had he made a mistake? His hand lingered over old letters. His gaze returned again and again to the empty seat beside his. He sent for news of Navier. When he heard of her rise, her quiet power in the Western court, the respect she commanded, the grace she carried despite the betrayal, his chest tightened. And when he heard of Heinrich, when he heard that the man once brushed off as a harmless diplomat now stood beside her, that he looked at her with laughter in his eyes and sincerity in his voice, something broke. Sovishu told himself it was jealousy, but deep down, he knew the truth. He had thrown away a queen. Back in the West, Navier sat alone in her study, reading reports from the provinces. The moonlight spilled through the tall windows, painting her desk in silver. A knock interrupted the silence. A messenger entered, bowed low, and handed her a letter. She recognized the seal immediately. Eastern Empire. She unfolded the parchment with calm hands, but her eyes sharpened with every line. It was from Sovishu? He missed her. He regretted everything. He wanted her to return. Navier closed the letter slowly. Outside, the night was still. But inside her heart, memories stirred, both beautiful and bitter. She had once loved him. She had once waited for him. But that woman, the one who waited, who endured, was gone. The Western court still doubted her. The past still chased her. But Navier no longer belonged to either. She would decide where her future lay. And no man, emperor or not, would choose for her again. The Western court still watched her, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. But Navier no longer cared. Each day, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Each evening, she walked the palace halls with purpose. And each time the nobles tried to question her loyalty, she answered with poise, precision, and power. In time, even the doubters had to admit, she was not just an empress in name. She was a ruler. But it wasn't just the court she was learning to navigate. It was Heinrich. At first, he kept his distance, not out of coldness, but out of respect. He never pressured her, never demanded affection or loyalty beyond what was required. Their marriage had begun as a transaction, a political rescue, a mutual escape. But slowly that began to change. Heinrich made her laugh when she least expected it, with dry wit and ridiculous impressions of the court advisors. He listened when she spoke, not because he had to, but because he genuinely cared. And when she grew quiet, retreating into thought, he gave her space, not as abandonment, but as understanding. One evening, they walked the palace gardens under the stars. It was a quiet night, the air cool and still. The scent of roses lingered in the breeze. You seem lighter, Heinrich said, glancing at her sideways. Navier raised an eyebrow. Lighter? He smiled. Not in weight, in spirit. She looked away, lips curving slightly. Perhaps I am. Heinrich hesitated. Then softly, you don't have to forget what happened. You just don't have to carry it alone. Navier didn't reply, but when he offered his arm, she took it. Not out of obligation, but choice. Their relationship shifted in quiet moments like these. Small, almost invisible. A shared glance across a council table. A private joke whispered in passing. The way her steps slowed slightly when he walked beside her, no longer out of formality, but comfort. He began joining her during her morning walks through the palace library. She began inviting him to discuss affairs of state, and found herself valuing his opinion. They shared meals, stories, old wounds. Neither said the word love, but something more dangerous and precious than love was growing between them. Trust? One rainy afternoon, Heinrich found her alone in the study, staring out the window. Thinking about him? He asked gently. Navier turned, caught off guard. There was no judgment in his voice, no accusation, only quiet understanding. No, she said truthfully. Not anymore. He smiled. Good. There was a pause. Then he added, because I'd rather be the one on your mind. Navier didn't answer. But when he left the room, she touched her chest. And for the first time in a long, long time, she realized her heart didn't hurt. It fluttered. It arrived like a shadow at noon, sudden, unwelcome, and impossible to ignore. A second letter. The seal, Eastern Empire. The signature, Sovishu. Navier read it in silence. The words were desperate now. Gone was the emperor who once stood tall in arrogance. In his place was a man unraveling, a man who had traded devotion for desire, and now begged for what he so easily discarded. He claimed regret. He claimed he had been blinded. He claimed that no one had ever matched her strength, her grace, her heart. And then came the unthinkable. Come back to me, Navier. I'll undo it all. I'll make you empress again. Just come home. Navier didn't move. The wind stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of lilacs from the garden below. Somewhere down the hall, Heinrich was laughing with a courtier. The sound was distant, warm, real. She looked at the parchment in her hand, and for a moment, just one, she remembered everything. The girl she had been, the love she had given, the silence she had endured. She remembered the first time Sovieshu held her hand, and the last time he looked at her without shame. But that woman, the one who sat quietly through betrayal, who held her crown even as her heart broke, was gone. This was not her home anymore. And Sovishu was no longer her emperor. Still, the court in the west buzzed with the news. The former emperor's plea had reached not just Nivier, but every noble in the land. The whispers returned. Will she go back? Does she still love him? Was this marriage just revenge? Navier said nothing, but Heinrich did. He found her in the royal conservatory, seated among blooming violets, her expression unreadable. I won't stop you, he said, voice low. If that's where your heart still is, I won't stand in your way. She turned to him slowly. There was no anger in his eyes, only sadness, only sincerity. You think I would leave? She asked quietly. I think you have the right to choose. For a long moment, there was only the sound of wind rustling through the glass ceiling. Then Navier rose to her feet. She stepped toward Heinrich, her gaze unwavering. I made my choice the day I said yes to you. He blinked. I didn't marry you to spite Sovishu. I married you because you saw me. Not as your property, not as your puppet, but as your partner. A pause. And for that, I will never leave. Heinrich didn't speak. Instead, he stepped closer, and for the first time, reached for her hand without hesitation. She let him take it. There were no grand declarations, no vows, no promises made in desperation. Just two people standing in quiet truth. Sovishu had sent a plea, but what he didn't realize was that Navier no longer needed to be chosen. She had already chosen herself. The court was filled with whispers. They spoke of a woman who had lost everything, and somehow gained even more. Navier Eli Trovi, once the Eastern Empire's perfect empress, now stood taller than ever. Not beside Sovishu, not in the shadows of her past, but at the heart of the Western Empire, in the full light of her own strength. Her name, once bound to scandal, now echoed through kingdoms with reverence, not as the abandoned wife, not as the woman replaced, but as the empress who rose again. In the months that followed Sovishu's failed plea, Navier grew into her new reign with quiet, undeniable power. Her people adored her. The nobles respected her, even those who once doubted her. Trade blossomed, diplomacy flourished, and the palace, once filled with cautious stares, now lit up in her presence. And beside her, always steady, always true, was Heinrich. What began in formality had bloomed into something sacred. A partnership built not on politics, but on trust, warmth, and time. Where Sovieshu had demanded loyalty without love, Heinrich offered love without condition. Their glances in council meetings now carried silent conversations. Their walks in the gardens no longer ended in silence, but in laughter. Where once Navière had been praised for poise, now she was cherished for her heart. One morning, she stood before the mirror as attendants placed the imperial diadem on her head. Gold and sapphire shimmered in the light. Heavy, yes, but no longer a burden. A symbol of all she had lost and all she had become. Later that day, she addressed the court, not as a woman scorned, but as a sovereign ruler. In this empire, she said, her voice ringing across the marble halls, we do not measure strength by how well one endures pain, but by how one rises from it. Heinrich watched her with quiet pride. And somewhere in a distant palace, Sovietshu sat alone, surrounded by regret, as her words traveled across the sea like thunder. Navier smiled, not at revenge, not at victory over him, but at the life she had built beyond him. She had been thrown aside. She had been humiliated. She had been doubted, but she had never been defeated. Now, she reigned not because of her title, but because she had reclaimed herself. Not just an empress, not just a wife. Navier Elitrovi, reborn.